True faith is not proven in comfort, but in pressure. It's easy to worship when worship is celebrated, easy to pray when prayer is protected, easy to believe when belief comes with applause and approval. But what happens when faith is met with silence, with suspicion, with punishment? The story of Daniel is not just ancient history, it's a mirror, a question posed across millennia. What do you do when faithfulness becomes dangerous? This is a story set in a foreign empire under unfamiliar laws, where quiet personal devotion drew the attention of the most powerful men in the world, where remaining faithful meant risking everything, where one man's refusal to hide his prayers would lead him into a den of lions and reveal something far greater than survival. It's a story about what faith looks like when tested, not by doubt, but by decree. Faith is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a feeling, a warm certainty that everything will work out, a guarantee of protection, a shield against suffering. But that's not what faith is. Not really. Faith is what remains when the feelings fade, when the guarantees disappear, when the shield is stripped away, and all that's left is a choice. Will you still believe? Will you still obey? Will you still pray? Daniel's story forces us to confront that question because his faith wasn't tested in a moment of spiritual ecstasy. It was tested in the cold machinery of political power, in the ruthless calculations of ambitious men, in a law that made devotion a capital offense. And yet he prayed, not because he was foolish, not because he didn't understand the danger, but because he understood something deeper, something that transcends empires and edicts and even lions. He understood that faithfulness is not measured by outcomes. It's measured by obedience, and that the God he served was worthy of trust, even when trust looked like walking into death. This is the story of a man who would not bend and the God who would not abandon him, a captive who rose to honor. Daniel was not born in Babylon. He was taken there. As a young man, he had been torn from Jerusalem during the conquest of Judah. The Babylonian Empire had swept through his homeland like a storm, crushing resistance, sacking the temple, and carrying away the brightest and best of Israel's youth. Daniel was among them, young, educated, from a noble family. He was dragged into captivity not as a criminal, but as a prize. The year was around 605 before the Common Era. King Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to Jerusalem, and the city had fallen. The treasures of the temple were plundered. The sacred vessels were carried off to the house of Nebuchadnezzar's gods, and the young men of noble birth were selected for a different kind of conquest: cultural assimilation. Daniel and his companions were to be educated in the language and literature of the Babylonians. They were to eat the king's food, drink the king's wine, and be transformed into servants of a pagan empire. The goal was clear: strip away their identity, replace their loyalty, and turn them into Babylonians. But exile did not break Daniel. It refined him. From the very beginning, he made choices, small choices that revealed the depth of his character. When offered the king's rich food and wine, Daniel politely refused, not out of ingratitude, but out of faithfulness. The food had been offered to idols. To consume it would be to participate, even indirectly, in pagan worship. So Daniel requested vegetables and water instead. It was a small act of defiance, quiet, respectful, but unmistakable, and God honored it. Daniel and his friends thrived on their simple diet. They grew stronger, healthier, wiser than all the other young men in the king's service. This became Daniel's pattern. While others adapted by abandoning their heritage, Daniel held on. While some forgot the God of their fathers, Daniel remembered in a foreign land under foreign rules surrounded by foreign gods. Daniel remained faithful. And that faithfulness, paradoxically, became his greatest strength. He was educated in the ways of Babylon. He learned their language, their literature, their customs. He mastered astronomy, mathematics, law, and administration. He became fluent in the complex bureaucracy of empire. He understood how power worked, how decisions were made, how kingdoms rose and fell. But he never forgot who he was. He never forgot where he came from. And he never forgot the God who had called his people out of Egypt, led them through the wilderness, and established them in the promised land. Even though that land was now under occupation, even though the temple was destroyed, even though his people were scattered, Daniel served in the court of kings, and he did so with such wisdom, such integrity, such undeniable excellence that even pagan rulers could not ignore him. When King Nebuchadnezzar had troubling dreams, it was Daniel who interpreted them. When the king saw a mysterious hand writing on the wall during a feast, it was Daniel who read the message and explained its meaning. When rulers needed counsel, they turned to Daniel, not because he was politically cunning, but because he was honest, not because he told them what they wanted to hear, but because he told them the truth. King Nebuchadnezzar had trusted him. King Belshazzar had summoned him in desperation. And now, under the rule of the Medes and Persians, Daniel continued to serve. Decades had passed since his capture. His hair had grayed. His body had aged. He had outlived kings, outlasted empires, survived revolutions. But his spirit, his devotion to God, remained as sharp as ever. He was not a priest. He was not a prophet in the traditional sense. He was a government official, an administrator, a man who handled budgets, policies, and politics. A man who navigated the treacherous waters of imperial bureaucracy. And yet, in the middle of that secular world, his faith never wavered. He prayed 3 times a day, every day, windows open, facing Jerusalem, kneeling before the God who had never abandoned him, even in exile. It was a discipline he had maintained for decades in youth and in old age, in favor and in obscurity, in safety and in danger. Prayer was not something Daniel did when he felt like it. It was not a hobby or a habit he picked up when convenient. It was the rhythm of his life, the foundation of his identity, the source of his strength. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening, Daniel would stop whatever he was doing, go to his room, open the windows toward Jerusalem and pray. He thanked God for his faithfulness. He asked for wisdom. He interceded for his people. He worshiped. He remembered. And it was this discipline, this quiet, consistent devotion that would soon place him in the crosshairs of envy. Because in the palace, Daniel was not alone. He was surrounded by officials, administrators, governors, and nobles. Men who had been born into privilege, men who had wealth, status, and connections. Men who understood how the game of power was played. And they were about to discover that Daniel was unbeatable. Not because he played the game better than them, but because he refused to play it at all, the new king's favor. When Darius the Mede took control of Babylon, the empire was in transition. The Babylonian dynasty had fallen. The night of Belshazzar's feast, the night of the writing on the wall had ended with conquest. The armies of the Medes and Persians had entered the city, and the throne had changed hands. Darius was a strategic king. He understood that ruling a vast empire required more than military might. It required organization, delegation, oversight, and most of all, trust. The Persian Empire was enormous. It stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing dozens of nations, languages, and cultures. Governing such a territory required a sophisticated administrative structure. So Darius restructured the government. He divided the empire into provinces, each overseen by a satrap, a regional governor with significant authority. He appointed 120 satraps to rule over different regions. But to keep them accountable, to prevent corruption and rebellion, Darius placed 3 high officials above them. These 3 would oversee the satraps, to report directly to the king and ensure that the empire ran smoothly. And among those 3, Daniel stood out. It wasn't favoritism, it was merit. Daniel had proven himself time and again across multiple administrations under multiple kings. His decisions were sound. His judgment was clear. His integrity was unshakable. He didn't scheme for power. He didn't play favorites. He didn't take bribes or bend the truth to suit political wins. While others maneuvered and manipulated, Daniel simply worked faithfully, excellently, without compromise. King Darius noticed. In meetings, Daniel's counsel was the most reliable. In crisis, Daniel's solutions were the most effective. In disputes, Daniel's judgments were the most fair. There was a steadiness about him, a wisdom that transcended political calculation, an honesty that made him trustworthy even in a world built on deception. Darius began to consider something bold, elevating Daniel above all the other officials, making him second only to the king himself, giving him authority over the entire empire. It was an extraordinary honor, a Hebrew exile rising to the highest position in a Persian empire, a foreigner trusted above native-born nobles, a man in his 80s being given more power than men half his age, a worshiper of the God of Israel being placed over men who bowed to Ahura Mazda and a pantheon of other deities. It was unprecedented, and it was dangerous because honor has a shadow, and that shadow is envy. The other officials watched Daniel's rise with growing resentment. They saw the king's favor. They saw Daniel's influence. They saw the way Darius consulted him, trusted him, they relied on him, and they hated it. Not because Daniel was corrupt, but because he wasn't. Not because he played political games, but because he refused to. Not because he was incompetent, but because his competence made them look inadequate by comparison. They were men of status, wealth, and power. They had spent their lives climbing the ladder of influence. They had made the right alliances, said the right things, positioned themselves strategically, and now this foreigner, this exile, this old man who refused to compromise, was about to be elevated above them all. It was intolerable. So they began to plot quietly at first, carefully. They met in private, away from the king's hearing. They shared their grievances, fueled each other's resentment, and began to strategize. Their goal was clear: destroy Daniel, remove him from power. I eliminate the threat he posed to their ambitions. But how? Daniel was beyond reproach. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't break rules. He didn't have skeletons in his closet. There was nothing to exploit, no scandal to uncover, no weakness to leverage. They couldn't beat him fairly, so they decided to destroy him unfairly. And to do that, they would need to use the one thing Daniel would never compromise: his faith, the plot against prayer. The conspirators gathered in secret. These were not common criminals. They were influential men, powerful men, men whose pride had been bruised by a foreigner's success, men whose ambition had been thwarted by a man who wouldn't play their games. They sat in a private chamber, voices low, plotting the destruction of a righteous man. One of them spoke first. We've been over his record a dozen times. And there's nothing, no bribes, no corruption, no scandals, no mistakes. The man is spotless. Another official leaned back, frustrated. How is that even possible? Everyone has something to hide. Everyone makes deals, cuts corners, looks the other way. But not Daniel. It's like he's carved from stone. He's not stone, the third voice interjected. He's flesh and blood like the rest of us. He has a weakness. We just haven't found it yet. They sat in silence, considering. Then one of them, perhaps the shrewdest of the group, spoke with cold clarity. We will never find any basis for charges against this man unless it has something to do with the law of his God. The room went still. Everyone understood immediately. It was brilliant, ruthless, but brilliant. Daniel's faith was his defining characteristic. Everyone knew he prayed. Everyone knew he worshiped the God of Israel. Everyone knew he was devout, disciplined, consistent. He prayed 3 times a day, every day without fail. It was as predictable as the sunrise. And if they could make that faithfulness illegal, even temporarily, they could trap him. The plan began to take shape. They would craft a law that seemed reasonable on the surface, but was designed with one target in mind, a law that would appeal to the king's ego while setting a trap for Daniel's faith. One of the officials leaned forward, sketching out the details. We approach the king together, all of us. We present a unified front. We tell him that the advisors, governors, and satraps have all agreed on a new decree. What kind of decree? Another asked. A loyalty decree. For 30 days, and anyone who prays to any god or human being except the king will be thrown into the lion's den. We frame it as a way to unify the empire, to strengthen the king's authority during this time of transition, and we make it irrevocable. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, once the king signs it, it cannot be changed, not even by the king himself. The others nodded slowly, seeing the elegance of the trap. 30 days was short enough to seem reasonable. The flattery would appeal to Darius, and the irrevocable nature of Persian law would ensure that once Daniel was caught, there would be no escape, no loopholes, no mercy. Daniel will never stop praying, one of them said with certainty. Exactly, the architect of the plan replied. He'll pray, we'll catch him. The king will have no choice but to enforce the law, and Daniel will be thrown to the lions. It was a perfect trap, cruel, calculated, and almost certainly effective. They rehearsed their approach, refining their pitch to the king. They would emphasize unity, loyalty, and the strength of Darius's rule. They would make it sound like a collective decision, not a personal vendetta. They would hide their true motive behind a veil of political wisdom, and then they would wait. Wait for Daniel to do exactly what they knew he would do. Wait for faithfulness to become a crime. Wait for the trap to spring. They left the meeting with smiles on their faces. Daniel's days were numbered, and they had just lit the fuse. A decree of death. The officials approached King Darius the next day. They came as a group, dozens of something. It was worth hearing. One of them continued, we propose that for the next them, creating the impression of consensus and unity. They bowed respectfully, their faces arranged in expressions of concern and loyalty. May King Darius live forever. They began using the traditional greeting. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all consulted together. We have agreed that your majesty should establish a royal decree and enforce it strictly. Darius listened, intrigued. These were his top officials. If they had come to agreement on 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. This will demonstrate the unity of the empire under your rule. It will show that all loyalty, spiritual and temporal, flows through you. Another official added, it will strengthen your authority during this time of transition. The people need to see that the empire is stable, that leadership is clear, that there is one central power they can trust. It was flattery, and it worked. Darius was a capable king, but like all rulers, he was not immune to ego. The idea of being elevated to a position of supreme reverence, even temporarily, was appealing. It seemed like a harmless gesture. 30 days wasn't long, and surely his subjects would have no problem directing their prayers to him for such a brief period. What Darius didn't know, what he couldn't see, was the trap hidden beneath the surface. The officials had carefully avoided mentioning Daniel. They had made it sound like a general decree, not a targeted attack. And Darius, trusting their counsel, saw no reason to refuse. Very well, the king said. Draft the decree. I will sign it. The officials moved quickly. They prepared the document with meticulous care, ensuring every word was precise, every clause was clear. The decree stated that for 30 days, no one in the empire could pray to any god or person except King Darius. Violation of this law would result in immediate execution by being thrown into the lion's den. And then they added the critical phrase, "This decree is issued in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Darius reviewed the document and signed it. His royal seal was pressed into the wax. The decree became law, irrevocable, absolute, binding even on the king who had issued it. The officials took the signed decree and distributed it throughout the empire. Heralds proclaimed it in the streets. Scribes posted it in public places. Within hours, everyone in Babylon knew for the next 30 days, all prayers must go through the king to pray to anyone else. Any god, any person was to invite death. And in his chambers, Daniel heard the news, the choice of obedience. Daniel was in the middle of his afternoon work when the decree reached him. A messenger brought word, reading the proclamation aloud with official formality. Daniel listened carefully, his face calm, his mind sharp. He understood immediately what this meant. This was not a general decree. It was aimed at him. The timing, the specificity, the irrevocable nature, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to destroy him. He knew who was behind it. He could name the officials who had always resented him, who had envied his position, who had waited for an opportunity like this. He understood their strategy, and they had crafted a law that would force him to choose between his God and his life. Daniel thanked the messenger and dismissed him. Then he sat alone considering his options. He could comply with the decree just for 30 days. It wasn't forever. He could pray silently in his heart where no one could see. He could close his windows, lock his doors, and keep his devotion private. He could survive the 30 days and then return to his normal practices once the decree expired. Many people would have chosen that path, and they would have justified it with reasonable arguments. God knows my heart. He understands. He wouldn't want me to die needlessly. I can serve him better alive than dead. This is just a temporary compromise. It's wisdom, not cowardice. But Daniel didn't see it that way. To him, hiding his faith was the same as denying it. And denying God, even to save his own life, was unthinkable. Prayer for Daniel was not just a religious duty. It was communion. It was relationship. It was the lifeline that connected him to the source of all wisdom, strength, and peace. To stop praying, even for a month, would be to cut himself off from the very thing that made him who he was. And there was something else, something deeper. Daniel understood that faithfulness is not proven in comfort. It's proven in pressure. It's easy to worship when worship costs nothing. It's easy to obey when obedience is convenient. But what does faith look like when it comes with a price? When devotion demands sacrifice? When following God means walking into danger? That's when faith is real. That's when it counts. That's when it reveals what's actually in a person's heart. Daniel had lived his entire life with integrity. He had served pagan kings with honesty. He had navigated political intrigue with honor. He had refused to compromise in 1,000 small ways over the course of decades. And now, in what might be the final test of his life, he would not bend. So when the time came for his evening prayer, Daniel did what he had always done. He went to his room, the same room where he had prayed for years, the same room with windows facing west toward Jerusalem, the same room where he had knelt thousands of times before. He opened the windows not as an act of defiance, not as a political statement, not to make a point, but because that's what he had always done. Because prayer was not something to be hidden or whispered in secret. Because his relationship with God was not shameful, and he would not treat it as if it were. He knelt down on the floor, his old knees pressing into the familiar stone. He raised his hands, he closed his eyes, and he prayed. He thanked God for his faithfulness, for sustaining him through decades of exile, for granting him favor with kings, for protecting his people even in captivity. He prayed for wisdom, for strength, for the exiles scattered throughout the empire. He prayed for King Darius that God would guide him. He prayed for his enemies that God would have mercy on them. And he prayed with peace, not with fear, not with anxiety, not with doubt, but with the calm assurance of someone who had walked with God for so long that trust had become instinct. Outside, in the shadows across the courtyard, his enemies watched. They had positioned themselves carefully where they could see through the open windows without being seen themselves. They had been waiting for this moment, counting on it. And now, as the evening light faded, they saw exactly what they had expected to see. Daniel on his knees, hands raised, lips moving in prayer, facing Jerusalem, praying to the God of Israel, exactly as they knew he would. The officials exchanged glances. Smiles crept across their faces. Silent gestures of satisfaction. They had him. The trap had worked. Now all they had to do was spring it. They watched Daniel finish his prayer, watched him stand slowly, his joints stiff with age, watched him close his eyes for a final moment of silent communion. And then they turned and left, moving quickly through the darkening streets toward the palace. They had a report to make and a righteous man to destroy. The arrest. The officials wasted no time. They went directly to King Darius, their voices urgent but controlled, their faces arranged in expressions of righteous concern. They found the king in his private chambers, reviewing documents by lamplight. He looked up as they entered, surprised by the late visit. "Your Majesty," one of them began, bowing deeply, "we come with a matter of great importance, a matter that concerns the law you recently signed." Darius set down his scroll, giving them his full attention. "Go on. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king's brow furrowed slightly. "Yes, I signed that decree. It stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." The officials nodded, their trap closing. "That is correct, Your Majesty. The law cannot be repealed, not even by you." Darius waited, sensing something beneath their words. One of the officials stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, we regret to inform you that one of your officials has violated this decree. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day to his God." The words hit Darius like a physical blow. Daniel, his most trusted official, the one man he had planned to elevate above all others, the one man whose counsel he relied on, whose integrity he trusted, whose wisdom he valued above all his other advisors. Caught in a trap that Darius himself had signed into law. The king's face went pale, his hands clenched. He looked at the officials, and in their eyes he saw something that made his stomach turn. Satisfaction. They weren't reporting a crime. They were celebrating a victory. Darius realized in that moment what had happened. He had been played, manipulated, used as a weapon against Daniel. The decree had never been about unity or loyalty. It had been about removing the one man who stood in the way of their ambitions. And he, Darius, king of the Medo-Persian Empire, had signed the order himself. "Get out," Darius said quietly, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. The officials hesitated. "Your Majesty, the law must be enforced." "I said, get out." The king's voice rose to a roar. "Leave me now." They bowed and withdrew, but their work was done. The trap was sprung. The law was clear, and there was nothing the king could do about it. Darius spent the rest of the day in anguish. He summoned his legal advisors, his counselors, his scholars. He reviewed the law from every angle, searching desperately for a loophole, an exception, a technicality, anything that could save Daniel. But Persian law was absolute. Once a decree was signed and sealed, it could not be altered. Not by circumstances, not by new information, not even by the king who had issued it. The law of the Medes and Persians was designed to be unbreakable to ensure that royal decrees carried absolute authority. And now that unbreakable law was about to kill the best man in the empire. Darius paced his chambers, his mind racing. Could he delay the execution? Could he reinterpret the law? Could he grant Daniel a pardon? No. The officials returned throughout the day reminding him of the law. They were relentless, sensing that the king might try to find a way out. Each time they spoke with false respect, but their message was clear. The law must be enforced. Daniel must die. Remember your majesty, they said again and again, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. As the sun began to set, Darius had exhausted every option. There was no way out. The law was clear, and his own signature had sealed Daniel's fate. With a heart heavier than stone, King Darius gave the order. Daniel was to be arrested and brought to the lion's den immediately. The night among lions. The lion's den was located on the outskirts of the city, carved into a rocky hillside. It was not a cage or an enclosure. It was a pit, a deep stone chamber accessible only from above. A vertical shaft led down into darkness, and at the bottom, the lions waited. These were not ordinary lions. They were kept hungry, trained to be aggressive, used specifically for executions. The den was a place of terror, a final destination for criminals and traitors. No one who entered the pit came out alive. Daniel was brought there under guard as the last light of day faded. A crowd had gathered. Palace officials, curious citizens, people who had heard the news and come to witness the execution of the famous Hebrew. The officials who had orchestrated this stood at the front, barely concealing their triumph. They watched as Daniel was led to the edge of the pit, his hands bound, his face calm. King Darius was there too. He had come himself, unable to stay away, hoping against hope for some last-minute miracle. He looked at Daniel, and his eyes were filled with grief. Daniel met the king's gaze. There was no accusation in his eyes, no bitterness, no resentment, just peace. A deep, unshakable peace. Ah, that transcended circumstance. Darius stepped forward, his voice breaking. Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. It was all he could offer, a hope, a prayer, a desperate wish that somehow, some way, the God of the Hebrews would intervene where the king could not. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the king's words. Then he was led to the edge of the pit. Ropes were lowered. Daniel was bound to them. And then slowly he was lowered into the darkness. The crowd watched in silence as he descended down through the narrow shaft, past rough stone walls into the blackness below. And then the ropes went slack. He had reached the bottom. From above, those gathered at the edge could hear sounds, movement, low growls, the scrape of claws on stone. The lions had caught his scent. A massive stone, too heavy for any man to move alone, was rolled over the opening of the pit. It settled into place with a hollow thud, sealing Daniel inside. The king's signet ring was pressed into clay and affixed to the stone. The seals of the nobles were added. It was official, legal, irreversible. Daniel was entombed with death itself, and then silence. The crowd began to disperse. The officials left satisfied. The guards returned to their posts, but King Darius remained, staring at the sealed stone, his face etched with torment. Finally, his attendants gently urged him back to the palace. He went, but he found no rest there. Darius returned to his chambers, but he could not eat. Servants brought him food, delicacies prepared by the palace chefs, but he waved them away. The thought of eating while Daniel was in the pit made him sick. He dismissed his musicians, his entertainers, his concubines. He wanted no distraction, no comfort, no pleasure. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, tormented by images of what was happening in that dark pit. Was Daniel still alive? Had the lions attacked immediately? Was he suffering? Was he afraid? Or had it already ended? The king could not stop thinking about Daniel's final words. May your God whom you serve continually rescue you. Darius had said it as a prayer, but he didn't know if he believed it. Could any God save a man from lions? Could any power overcome the natural order? The night stretched on. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Darius lay awake, listening to the silence of the palace, imagining the sounds in the pit. Growls, roars, screams. But he heard nothing, only silence, and he did not know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. Below the earth, in the darkness of the pit, something extraordinary was happening. Daniel had landed softly on the stone floor. He had expected impact, braced for it, but the descent had been gentle. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he became aware of shapes moving around him. Large shapes, muscular bodies covered in fur, eyes gleaming in the faint light from above. The lions, there were several of them, males and females, powerful creatures, apex predators, capable of tearing a man apart in seconds. Daniel could smell them, the scent of animals, of meat, of danger. He could hear their breathing, the soft pad of their paws on stone. And then he felt something else, a presence not physical, not visible, but undeniable, as real as the stone beneath him, as certain as his own heartbeat, an angel. Daniel could not see the angel clearly. There was a sense of light, of form, of otherness. But more than that, there was an overwhelming sense of protection, of authority, of divine power that filled the space and held back the natural instincts of the beasts. The lions approached Daniel. They circled him, their breath hot on his skin. They sniffed at him, assessing him, their muscles tense and ready, but they did not attack. They could not. Something held them back. Something closed their mouths. Not metaphorically, literally. The angel of the Lord stood between Daniel and death, and the lions, creatures of instinct and hunger, were rendered harmless. Daniel sat down on the stone floor. His bound hands made it awkward, but he managed. And then he did something that would have seemed insane to any observer. He rested. He leaned back against the wall of the pit. He closed his eyes and he slept not fitfully, not anxiously, but peacefully because he was not alone. Because the God he had served for a lifetime had not abandoned him. Because even here in this place of death, divine presence was nearer than fear. The lions settled around him. Some lay down, some continued to pace, but none of them touched him. Throughout the long night, as King Darius lay awake in agony, Daniel rested in the presence of God. And when morning came, the king rose before dawn, unable to wait any longer. Divine protection. At the first light of dawn, King Darius was already on his way to the lion's den. He didn't wait for attendants. He didn't summon guards. He went himself, moving through the empty streets with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. He reached the hillside as the sun broke the horizon, casting golden light across the stone. The sealed entrance stood before him, undisturbed. The clay seals were intact. No one had tampered with it. Darius approached slowly, his heart pounding. His mind was filled with dread. He expected to find silence, death, the awful confirmation that Daniel was gone. But he had to know. He had to see, even if it meant confronting the worst. He owed Daniel that much. The king stood at the edge of the pit and called out. His voice cracked with emotion. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? For a moment, there was nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that crushes hope, the kind that confirms every fear. Darius felt his knees weaken. He had been a fool to hope, a fool to believe, a fool to think that, and then a voice clear, calm, alive. May the king live forever, Darius gasped. His hands flew to the stone, gripping the rough surface as if to steady himself. Daniel, Daniel, my God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Tears streamed down Darius's face. He shouted orders to the guards who had followed him. "Lift him out. Get him out now. Break the seals. Move the stone." The guards rushed forward. They broke the clay seals, destroying the official markings. They strained against the massive stone, pushing it aside with great effort. The opening was revealed and ropes were quickly lowered into the darkness. Daniel grabbed hold of the ropes and they pulled him up. Slowly, carefully, he emerged from the pit, rising from death itself. When he reached the surface, Darius rushed to him. The king examined him closely, searching for injuries, blood, wounds, anything that would indicate the horrors of the night. But there was nothing, not a scratch, not a bruise, not a torn garment. Daniel stood before him as if he had spent the night in his own bed, not in a pit of predators. His clothes were intact, his breathing was steady, his eyes were clear. He looked rested, at peace, unharmed. It was impossible and yet undeniable. The guards peered down into the pit, and what they saw confirmed the miracle. The lions were there prowling, agitated now, their hunger evident. These were not tame animals. They were killers, and yet for an entire night they had not touched Daniel. Darius embraced Daniel, weeping openly. "I thought I had lost you. I thought—" His voice failed him. Daniel placed a hand on the king's shoulder. "God is faithful, your majesty. He has always been faithful, even here." The king stepped back, looking at Daniel with a mixture of awe and wonder. "Your God, he did this? He saved you?" "Yes," Daniel said simply. "He sent his angel." The angel shut the mouths of the lions. Darius turned to the guards, his grief transforming into rage. "Bring them to me, all of them. Every official who brought charges against Daniel, bring them here now." The officials were found in the city, some still celebrating what they thought was their victory. They were dragged from their homes, their faces confused at first, then horrified as they saw Daniel standing alive beside the king. Darius looked at them with cold fury. "You sought to destroy a righteous man. You used my authority to commit murder. You manipulated the law and manipulated me. You will face the fate you intended for him." The conspirators began to protest, to plead, to make excuses. But Darius silenced them with a gesture. He wanted the lion's den. "You will have it." The officials were seized. Not just them, but their families as well. In the justice system of the ancient world, the guilt of a traitor often extended to his household. It was brutal, it was harsh, but it was the law. They were brought to the edge of the pit, and one by one they were thrown in. This time there was no angel. This time the lions were not restrained. The Bible records it plainly. Before they even reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them. The same beast that had ignored Daniel for an entire night fell upon the conspirators with savage speed. There was no mercy, no delay, only swift, terrible justice. The sounds that came from the pit were awful and brief. Within moments it was over. Darius turned away, his expression grim. He felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only a deep weariness. A recognition that evil left unchecked destroys itself. But there was something else, something that stirred in the king's heart. A recognition of power beyond human understanding, a glimpse of something divine. He turned to Daniel. "Your God, tell me about him." And Daniel did. "A decree of truth, king." Darius returned to his palace, but he could not rest. The events of the past day had shaken him to his core. He had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything he thought he understood about the world, about power, about the gods. He had seen a man survive the unsurvivable. He had seen beasts tamed by invisible authority. He had seen faith vindicated in the most dramatic way imaginable. And it had changed him. Darius summoned his scribes. I want to issue a decree, not a law that can be manipulated or twisted, a declaration of truth, something that will reach every corner of the empire. The scribes prepared their materials, and waiting for the king's words. Darius paced as he spoke, his voice filled with conviction. Write this to all peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land. May you prosper greatly. The scribes wrote quickly, capturing every word. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. The scribes paused, surprised. But Darius continued, his voice gaining strength, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. It was an extraordinary proclamation, a pagan king publicly honoring the God of Israel. Not because of political pressure, not because of tradition, but because he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The decree was copied and distributed throughout the empire. From India to Ethiopia, across 127 provinces, the message went out. Not a command to worship exclusively, not a forced conversion, but a recognition, an acknowledgement, a testimony. The God of Daniel was real, and he was worthy of reverence. In Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, the news was received with tears of joy. For decades, they had lived as exiles, their faith marginalized, their God dismissed as the deity of a conquered people. But now the most powerful king on earth had declared that their God was the living God, that his kingdom would never end. It was vindication, not just for Daniel, but for all of them. And Daniel simply continued doing what he had always done. He served faithfully. He prayed consistently. He honored God quietly. His position was not only restored, it was elevated. The king's trust in him deepened beyond measure. His influence grew. His reputation spread far beyond the borders of Persia, carried by the story of the night he spent among lions and walked out unharmed. But Daniel did not boast. He did not write memoirs or seek fame or leverage his miraculous survival for political gain. He remained the same man he had always been, humble, faithful, devoted. Years passed. Daniel continued to serve under Darius and later under Cyrus the Persian. He witnessed the decree that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. He saw the beginning of the fulfillment of prophecies he had prayed over for decades. And through it all, he remained a man of prayer. 3 times a day, every day windows open, facing Jerusalem, kneeling before the God who had never abandoned him. His faith had been tested in the most extreme way imaginable, and it had held. Not because Daniel was special, but because the God he served was faithful. The lion's den had been meant to silence him. Instead, it became a pulpit, a testimony that would echo through generations. Proof that no empire, no decree, no threat could separate a faithful soul from the God they serve. Legacy of faithfulness. The story of Daniel and the lion's den would be told and retold for thousands of years. It would inspire countless believers facing persecution, pressure, and impossible choices. It would become a symbol of what faith looks like when tested by fire or, in this case, by fangs. But what made Daniel's story so powerful was not just the miracle, it was the man. Daniel didn't become faithful the night he was thrown into the den. He had been faithful every day before that, for decades in obscurity and in prominence. When it was easy and when it was hard, his faith was not reactive. It was rooted. He had established patterns of devotion long before they became costly. He had built a life around prayer, not because he anticipated a crisis, but because prayer was the foundation of his relationship with God. When the test came, he didn't have to decide what kind of man he would be. He already knew. He had decided years before, in 1,000 small daily choices. That's the real lesson of Daniel's story. Faithfulness is not forged in the moment of crisis. It's forged in the moments no one sees. In the quiet mornings and evenings, in the daily discipline of showing up, kneeling down, and praying even when you don't feel like it, even when no one is watching, even when it seems like it doesn't matter. Because those unseen moments, those private acts of devotion, are what carry you through when faithfulness becomes costly. Daniel's enemies knew this about him. They knew he would never stop praying because prayer was not a habit for Daniel. It was who he was. It was as essential to him as breathing. To ask Daniel to stop praying was to ask him to stop being Daniel. And that's what made him dangerous to them. Not his intelligence, though he was brilliant. Not his influence, though he had plenty, but his integrity, his consistency, his refusal to compromise. In a world built on negotiation and political maneuvering, Daniel was immovable. And immovable men are threatening to those whose power depends on everyone playing along. But to God, Daniel's faithfulness was precious. It was the kind of devotion that moves heaven. Not loud devotion, not showy devotion, but consistent, costly, quiet devotion. The kind that says, I will worship you whether you rescue me or not, whether it's safe or dangerous, whether people applaud or condemn. That's the kind of faith that shuts the mouths of lions. After Daniel's miraculous survival, his influence in the Persian court only grew. But more importantly, his testimony reached far beyond the palace. Jews throughout the empire heard the story and were encouraged. Their God had not forgotten them. Their faith was not foolish. Even in exile, even under foreign rule, God was still sovereign. Daniel's story also reached future generations. When Jewish children heard about the lion's den, they learned that God could be trusted in the darkest circumstances. When young believers faced persecution in the early church, they remembered Daniel and took courage. When reformers stood against corrupt institutions, when missionaries entered hostile territories, when ordinary believers faced pressure to deny their faith, they remembered the old man who refused to stop praying. Daniel became a symbol, but he would have hated that. He never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to be faithful. And in being faithful, he became more than a symbol. He became a testimony, living proof that God honors those who honor him. That faithfulness is never wasted, even when it looks like it will cost everything. Epilogue: Courage and quiet devotion. The story of Daniel is not just about lions. It's about choices, small, quiet, daily choices that define who we are when the cost of faithfulness rises. Faith is built in the ordinary moments, in the decision to pray when you're tired, to worship when you're discouraged, to trust when circumstances scream that trust is foolish. These are the moments that matter. These are the moments that prepare you for the test you can't predict. Daniel didn't suddenly become a man of faith when the decree was signed. He had been that man for 80 years, through exile, through service to pagan kings, through the rise and fall of empires. His faith was tested constantly in small ways and large ways, and each time he chose faithfulness. When he was a young man, he chose to honor God's dietary laws, even when it seemed unnecessary. When he interpreted troubling dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, he spoke truth even when it was dangerous. When the kingdom changed hands, he continued to serve with integrity, even though he could have retired, disappeared, faded into obscurity. Every small choice reinforced the pattern. Every act of obedience deepened the roots. So when the ultimate test came, when faithfulness meant facing death, Daniel didn't have to think about it. He simply kept doing what he had always done. That's the power of consistency. That's the strength of a life built on daily devotion, and it's available to anyone. Daniel was not superhuman. He was not born with extraordinary courage. He was a man who chose again and again, day after day, to trust God, to pray, to obey, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was difficult, even when it cost him everything. The question the story poses to us is not, could you survive a night with lions? The question is, are you building a life that would prepare you for that night? Are you praying when no one is watching? Are you choosing integrity when compromise would be easier? Are you trusting God in the small moments so that trust becomes instinct in the big ones? Because the truth is, most of us will never face a literal lion's den, but we will all face moments where faithfulness becomes costly, where obedience means sacrifice, where following God means swimming against the current. We'll face pressure at work to cut corners. We'll face social pressure to stay silent about our beliefs. We'll face internal pressure to prioritize comfort over conviction. We'll face 1,000 small moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And in those moments, it will discover what we're actually made of. We'll discover whether our faith is real or just theoretical. We'll discover whether we've been building on rock or on sand. Daniel built on rock, and when the storm came, when the decree was signed, when the officials gathered, when the pit yawned open, he stood firm. Not because he was brave, but because he had spent a lifetime learning to trust. The lions couldn't touch him, not because they lacked teeth or hunger, but because something greater was present in that pit, something sovereign, something kind. Something that sees the faithfulness of those who serve in quiet devotion and does not forget. God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, but God had been with Daniel long before that night. In the daily prayers, in the decades of service, in the countless small acts of faithfulness that no one saw. That's where miracles really happen. Not just in the dramatic moment of rescue, but in the quiet formation of a soul that's learned to trust, in the daily discipline that prepares a heart to endure, in the choice to keep praying when prayer seems pointless, to keep obeying when obedience is costly, to keep believing when everyone around you thinks you're foolish. Daniel prayed with his windows open because hiding was never an option, because he knew that faith practiced in secret out of fear is faith that has already begun to erode. He chose visibility. He chose consistency. He chose God even when it cost him everything. And God honored that choice, not because Daniel was perfect, but because his devotion was genuine, not because he was fearless, but because he trusted something greater than fear. The lion's den is not just a story from the past. It's a symbol, a reminder, a mirror. We all face moments where faithfulness becomes inconvenient, where truth becomes costly, where integrity demands sacrifice. And in those moments, we get to choose: hide or stand, compromise or remain, bend or hold. Daniel chose to hold, and in doing so, he discovered something ancient and eternal. Even in the darkest dens, God's presence remains nearer than fear. So the question remains, not for Daniel, but for us. What do we do when faithfulness becomes dangerous? When obedience is outlawed? When following God means risking everything we built? Do we pray with our windows open, or do we close them just to survive? Daniel's answer echoes across the centuries, and it's not complicated. It's not dramatic, it's not loud. It's simply this: keep praying, keep trusting, keep standing even when the lions are waiting, even when the law is signed, even when everyone is watching, because God is nearer than fear, and his faithfulness never fails, even in the den.